Hi, we continue today after Cain's wife bore a son Enoch, and Cain built a city and named it after his son, with the generations of Cain. And as we come to the end of chapter 4, although we're not quite to the end of it, we'll see this is the beginning of two genealogies, one of this failed line of Cain, and then another of Adam and Eve again, where they have another son, Seth, that replaces this line. So we'll see how the authors here are presenting a fork in the road, and we know what's coming. We know the flood will be coming in the next couple of chapters, and the Cain lineage will be completely wiped out because Noah comes from the Seth lineage. So even though, as we'll see here, it describes Cain's descendants as the father or ancestor of those who make tools and those who play musical instruments, in fact, according to the Genesis narrative, these people are completely wiped out, and those traditions must come from somewhere else. So there's a logical inconsistency there, but we won't worry about that because that's probably not really the point of what the Genesis authors are trying to say. So let's jump into our text here and look at a couple of the details, and then we'll focus on the elements that relate to the development of technology and civilization and see what we think of that there. So we left off with Cain building the city and naming it after Enoch, and then we saw the first part of this verse. Enoch was born Irad, and we noted that's related to the city Eridu, one of the great ancient cities of the Sumerian world in current-day Iraq. And Irad is the father of Mehujael, and we see a couple of these generations which are meaningless. Nothing is said about them. Their names don't mean anything in particular, to get us to Lamech. And Lamech is the seventh generation from Adam, and seventh generation is a standard biblical symbol for how something acts over the long haul. So whether a practice is healthy or not for the seventh generation is the way it's often looked at. Unlike in our modern global capitalist thing where it's what's good for the next quarter for stock investors, this is looking at the long haul of 7 generations. And so we see the lineage of Adam has led us to Lamech here, the only descendant at this point, because we saw that obviously Abel was dead, and we don't see that these generations had any more than one child per generation, which is unlikely, but that's how the narrative frames this in this linear way. So we get to Lamech in verse 19, and we're told he takes 2 wives. The name of one was Ada, and the name of the other Zillah. And this sets up the question of how we're interpreting this section, because there are many angles of approach to see Lamech as a good guy or a bad guy. And some Christian commentators on the conservative side say, see, he's starting with polygamy, that's bad. And so that's a criticism of him. But is the text concerned with polygamy? We'll see that Jacob, Mr. Israel himself, has 2 wives and 2 concubines and has children with all of those, and those children all become the ancestors of the tribal descendants of Jacob. So we certainly don't see any criticism later in Genesis of polygamy, and there's no reason to expect it is here. Another angle is to see Lamech as a celebration of the origin of civilization, and certainly older German commentators saw that, certainly with the development of instruments, both musical instruments and forged instruments of bronze and iron, as a development of culture and civilization, and a positive thing there. So really, it's testing the lens of the audience and readers as to whether we think this is good or bad. It will end in violence, and again, whether violence is good or bad depends on one's perspective. So the text, as usual, does not provide direct judgment, but leaves us as readers to interpret it. So let's look a little more closely and see what some of the details are that help us to understand what's going on here. So the name of the first wife, Ada, probably means something like ornament or pretty. Esau will have a wife of the same name later. And Zillah from Tzal, meaning shadow or a tinkling sound of a human voice, like a light voice. And there may be links with that, but since they're not mentioned other than as the mothers of these children, we're not going to make too much out of that. And then we note here, and I won't go through the note, but the note describes how many cultures have stories that describe the ancestors of civilization, whether in the Greek culture or others. For example, in the Greek culture, we might know Pan as the god of shepherds, the inventor of the flute, and other things like that. So certainly the Genesis authors are not playing out against the Greek culture, but perhaps are continuing to parody the Babylonian culture here in these elements that make for the legitimizing of the violence that we see in the city life that will follow. And certainly there's going to be nothing wrong with musical instruments. I can't imagine anybody thinking musical instruments are somehow a bad thing. But of course it depends what they're used for. They can be used to play We Shall Overcome, and they can be used to play Nazi music. So music itself doesn't necessarily tell us what it's being used for or whether it's in accordance with God's will or not. So let's continue with the generations. So the 2 wives have children. The first wife, Ada, has 2 sons, apparently, and the third son is born of the second wife. But notice the differences in how these are framed. So add aboard Jabal, and notice how Jabal and Jubal are very close in the Hebrew. It's just, they're almost identical. The father or ancestor of those who live in tents and have livestock. So not just those who live in tents, but live in tents and have livestock. So as many commentators have noted, more generally the equivalent of the Bedouin trading life, but certainly it's going to be the life of Abraham and Sarah and those kinds of people later, as we'll see. So that's not necessarily anything negative, it's just a description. But why that description in particular? Why the only form of social organization that's being named here, especially as children who apparently grew up in a city that Cain built would live in tents? Why would they not be living in a city? We're not told they live in the city of Enoch, but what would be the point of building the city if he doesn't have his own family live in it? So that's a little piece that's left open by the text. One of the ironic things here is we don't see that Cain's descendants are city dwellers or are doing the kinds of things that are dependent upon having a city to enable them to do that. And obviously tents are anti-city. And many times in the Bible we see tents as opposed to temples and houses, expressing the free nomadic viewpoint. Like Yahweh in Revelation 21 tented amidst New Jerusalem. So we see in verse 21 here, his brother's name was Jubal, the ancestor of all those who play the lyre, which is the kinnor and pipe. And here we can hear a little bit of a lyre from the ancient, the lyre is not from the ancient world, but we can hear the sound of this kinnor playing a setting of Psalm 23 just for a few seconds. So perhaps that tinkling sound of that kinnor is also an expression of a play on the name there as well. Here we can see an ugab, an ancient pipe, although I could not find anybody playing one, or an ancient flute. It's basically like a flute, and again in many cultures associated with the Greek myth of Pan, but no reason to think that the Pan myth has influenced the authors of Genesis here. So we have music first, and note the no connection here between the father of musicians and the father of those who live in tents and have livestock. Then the other wife, Zillah, bores Tubal-Cain, Tubal having several explanations for the name, but nothing that is particularly enlightening as far as I can tell, so we'll move on from that. But more interestingly, here is what's described. The ORC has made, but the Hebrew, lotesh, means to sharpen or hammer, and it's connected with another noun here, a verb, koresh, which is to forge. So literally it's those who sharpened forged tools. And you can see in my note below a range of translations that we see from different places. New International has who forged all kinds of tools. King James has instructor of every artificer, and you see some others there. So there's some ambiguities, but literally it has to do with sharpening. And the link there, as you can see from 1 Samuel 13, is where it's described the Philistines controlled the power of sharpening tools. What good are tools if they can't be sharpened? So it's not a matter of making them here, it's a matter of sharpening them. And here's a couple of images of some of the ancient tools from the Bronze Age. Here you see an adze and an axe. Obviously the coloring is a function of the copper aging over time. It's not a decorative coloring of them. But you can see that those are fairly well forged. You could really hurt somebody with one of those. And it doesn't say in a couple verses what Lamech used to kill or wound somebody, but certainly those tools could be used as weapons. And for all kinds of things. The word for bronze, nechuses, or copper, is only here in Genesis but 140 times in the Hebrew Scripture. And similarly, the word for iron here, barzel, is only here in Genesis but 76 times in Scripture. And the reason for that probably is that throughout the rest of Genesis we don't hear about people using these kinds of tools. That even though we can situate the story earlier than the Bronze Age historically, and not the audience's world but the story world, we just do not see many tools like that listed, and the words indicate that. And then something strange here is the sister of Tubal-Cain is named. And as the womanist scholar Will Gaffney notes here on the note you see below, hers is a paradigm-shifting family, naming women in the androcentric chronicle of a patriarchal family. It makes you wonder why. Because in the genealogy in chapter 5 of Seth's descendants, we don't see sisters named. We rarely see mothers named. So now we've had two wives of Cain, of Lamech named, and the sister named Nama, meaning pleasant or lovely. It's really at root the same root as Naomi. But again, why the authors put that there, we can't really know. So let me scroll down so I can get the last couple of verses of our key passage on the screen here. And so we see in this the first poetic parallelism, and I have it down in the note below, and you can see it just as well there. Lamech said to his wives, Ada and Zillah, hear my voice. You wives of Lamech, listen to what I say. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. The two-line parallelism is common to Hebrew poetry, especially in the Psalms. So if you're not familiar with that, it's often the second line repeats things of the first line, often intensifying them or expressing them in some other way. So we see the synonym here between Ada and Zillah and wives of Lamech, and the parallel also with hear my voice and listen to what I say. But the second strophe there is more complicated because the Hebrew isn't nearly as clear as it might sound like it is in the translation there. So I'll bring it up here just to highlight something as we go. And it's a technical thing, but we have to look at that carefully. So here Lamech said to his wives, hear my voice, Shema on, and we'll hear that as Shema Kol in another number of other places here, and listen to what I say. I have killed a man, or I shall kill a man. So as that you can see in my note below, it could be an announcement after the fact, or it could be an announcement of intention as we go. Thank you to Von Walde for that note. And then because it's poetic parallelism, the assumption is it's the same victim, that there's a single victim who's described as a man and then as a young man, a yeled, as we'll see. But one of the issues is it in response or is it a cause? So, as Kasuda argues down below, the Lamech, which I can show you here, right here, this Lamech, is problematic for the translation in the New RSV that we see. And he argues for Lamech is the cause of the wound that leads to death, leading to this paraphrased translation. See, my wives, how great is my strength. A mere tap from my hand suffices to slay a young and powerful man. I touched my enemy only lightly with my fingertips, and yet as soon as I inflicted a wound or bruise, I killed him. So, in that interpretation, Lamech is boasting of his surprising power that even he didn't know how strong he was. Or is it a matter of escalating vengeance? Because certainly verse 24 seems to suggest that. So, the Yeled here, as Wittenberg notes here, in order to draw out the utter illegitimacy of the act, the picture is one of the strongest men in the society killing one of the weakest men in society, a mere boy. But that's only one possible interpretation of that. And because it's a poetic form, I don't think we're expected to take that overly literally. Here, the Leftitzi is here. Leftitzi is only here in Genesis also. So notice the number of words in this passage that are unique to this scene. Although authors don't seem to suggest any reason to think it's been added later or edited in later. There's no Yahweh mentioned here, so we can't determine whether it's a Yahwist text on that basis because these people are not in relationship with God at all, which is certainly a basis for deciding that even if we personally think tools of music and tools of forging are good things, making them apart from God plainly is leading to a path of destruction, and the flood will come soon enough to illustrate that. So we get to our last verse here, and this classic statement, which is then, of course, echoed into the New Testament in Jesus. If Cain is avenged sevenfold, truly Lamech 77-fold. And so let's look at that a little more closely. The word here for avenge, as we saw last time, is only in these two places in Genesis, so specifically echoing the previous scene, highlighting that this is a tradition in this lineage. So now Lamech, several generations after Cain, we don't know how old these people are. We're not told, as we'll be told in other generations, how long people live, highlighting long generations of overlapping lineages. But it's reasonable to assume that Cain is gone by now. Whether he's simply an old man or gone, one way or another, the tradition of sevenfold vengeance that Yahweh told him would protect him has been passed on here. And the 77-fold echoes the question of sevenfold violence or vengeance elsewhere. Is it an expression of Lamech having way more power for vengeance, or is it an expression of something else? Either way, in the New Testament, we know this comes out in reverse. We hear it, for example, in this passage from Matthew 18. Then Peter said to Jesus, Lord, how many times should I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Should I forgive as many as 7 times? Jesus said, not just 7 times, but rather as many as 77 times. So, of course, Jesus isn't saying 77 and not 78. He's taking Peter's statement that forgiveness could extend 7 times, which is an amazing statement. How many people would forgive somebody 7 times? But Jesus is basically extending that out into the infinite, to forgive forever. So plainly, the New Testament sees Cain's and Lamech's vengeance as negative, and Jesus offers a reversal of that. So any modern writers, not so modern these days, but writers perhaps from a generation ago, who wanted to raise up the lineage of Cain as celebrating civilization, are plainly missing the New Testament condemnation of vengeance here in place of God engaging in vengeance, and of this violence of murder altogether. The lineage of Cain will be gone. And so we won't hear from him again. And as you see in the next verse, Adam knew his wife again. And that will lead us to the possibility of hope of a different path. And we'll turn to that next time. See you then. Bye-bye.